Well, good afternoon, folks, and welcome. I know lunch is right behind me, so you guys are going to be anxious for me to get through my content so you can eat. Just a show of hands. First off, how many people went to the event last night? Show of hands. All right. How many people know people who went to the event last night that didn't make it today? A few people. Okay, it's not bad. Normally it's much more than that. So, but welcome and thank you very much for joining us today. We hope the week is going well for you. We're going to spend some time in the next hour or so talking about SQL Server and the integration of SQL Server with SharePoint. So it's kind of a twofer. How many people are SharePoint administrators in here? Nice. And how many people are SQL administrators? Very cool. And how many people are both? Both hands. All right. Okay. So there's going to be good information for both of you. The cool thing I like to do in this session is often there's a lot of IT pros on the SharePoint side who don't know a lot about SQL Server, so I like to do an introduction of what SQL Server is about and kind of give them the groundwork or the framework for communicating with their DBAs so they can go in and have an intelligent conversation with their DBAs to get them that information. That's what this is going to be about, is optimizing SQL Server 2012 for SharePoint 2013. That's a trick title. Why is it a trick title? It's because you could swap out SQL Server 2008 there with SharePoint 2010, and 99% about what we're going to talk about will be relevant. You could swap out SQL Server 2005 with SharePoint 2007, and what we're about to talk about will be relevant. I put the latest versions up there because if I put up SQL Server 2005 with SharePoint 2007, who would be here? Me and my video and producer back there. That'd be it. So everything we're going to talk about is relevant regardless if you're working with SQL Server 2012 or SQL Server 2008, SharePoint 2010, SharePoint 2013. The integration and the concepts that we're going to discuss are going to be relevant that way. Either way. My name is Brian Alderman. I live in Scottsdale, Arizona in the U.S. Anybody else from the U.S. in this room? Anybody else is over here? Okay. I live in Scottsdale, and it's the southwest part of the country. And the temperatures, as you can see, are a little warm this time of year. We're supposed to hit 117 there tomorrow. About 5, well, it's a little bit longer than that. About 8, 9, 10 years ago, it got above 120 and planes can't take off. And they're actually concerned about that on Friday or Saturday of this week. So it's night. I'm sorry? That's right, too. That's right. Yeah, you guys do Celsius. So it's hot. We'll put it that way. It's really hot. So anyways, it's good to be out of there for a week while I'm here. The weather's been perfect. Thank you for ordering good weather for us. We've enjoyed that. My name is Brian Alderman, as I said. I've got several certifications. I have my own company. I do authoring, consulting, training, and speaking. I spoke at the Italian SharePoint Conference back in March, the Evolutions Conference in London in April, this conference this week. I like to travel around and do speaking events as well as writing. I've co-authored 2 books, SharePoint 2010 Administrator Companion for MS Press. I'm co-authoring an MS Press Inside Out for SharePoint 2013 Administration. And I've authored the Expert SharePoint 2013 Administration book. All of these 2 new books should be available in print by September. And the last one is from A Press instead of MS Press, excuse me. So I try to dig into the content and spend some time with that. If you like to stalk people, my Twitter handles are Brian Alderman or MicroTechPoint. I tweet on both of those if you want to keep track of where I'm speaking or what I'm doing or updates on my books or blogging. I do some blogging as well. My email address is up there. If we're 3 weeks down the road, it's like, man, I can't remember what he said about this. Feel free to ping me and send me an email, depending if I'm in the country or out of the country or what country I'm in or where I'm at, but I will respond to you at some point. All right, so feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions after the event or the session here. This is not the session on, there's another event going out in the conference in this venue. It's called the Mulla Fest. I'm pronouncing that the way I think it is. I'm not a tattoo artist. That's what the other conference for. So if you're in the wrong room, you can leave at this point. But if you're looking for a tattoo, we won't be doing that in this room. That's in the other part of the venue. Anybody get a tattoo this morning after their hangover from last night? Okay, good. Good, because we didn't want to, we want you to learn a lot, but we don't want you, we want you to remember a lot, but we don't want your spouses to go, what were you doing out there? So I just want to make sure that you know which room you're in. All right, so we're going to do a SQL Server introduction for those of you that are IT pros in the SharePoint world. And we're going to talk about how SharePoint SQL Server integrate. And then I'm going to go into SQL. I'm not even going to open up Central Admin. I'm going to go into SQL Server. And our DBAs are going to be saying, OK, I get that, I get that. But for those of you that have raised both hands, that maybe not be as familiar with the SQL Server side, but know it's very, very important, we'll learn what you can do in the SQL Server world to help balance out and manage the SharePoint world and optimize that SharePoint world. So we'll look at that, and then we'll wrap up with some best practices for optimizing SharePoint, still focusing on the SQL Server world. Okay, so most of you, I think, can spell SQL, so we're good on that piece of it there. And what we're going to do is just kind of walk through this agenda together here. So your DBAs, those guys are cool. So first off, for you DBAs, my recommendation whenever I present, whether it's at a conference or I'm teaching an admin class, is I promote that your SharePoint admins take you to lunch once a month. Okay? So you guys should be getting plenty of food from the SharePoint admins. Because I tell them they can have decent conversations with you over lunch that you normally wouldn't have in a hallway conversation. So for instance, let's say I'm a SharePoint admin and I'm deciding I'm going to take July 4th week off I'm not going to take it off, I'm going to actually roll out an upgrade to SharePoint. Well, over lunch with my DBA, I find out my senior DBA is out to lunch that week. Only my junior DBA is in town. Maybe I don't want to roll out my upgrade to SharePoint that week. So there's conversations like that you can have with your DBAs that will be beneficial for you as a SharePoint admin. So on the company card, of course, try to take your DBAs, your SQL DBAs out lunch once a month to kind of maintain that relationship and share information that you can learn from conferences or books that you may read that the DBA may not be familiar with. Oh, that a SharePoint instance of SQL Server is unique in that aspect. And you can provide that information to them. So one of the things our DBAs can do is install SQL Server. They have to do that once, and they can install up to 50 instances on the same physical or virtual box, all right, up to 50. The first one is called the default instance. It doesn't have to have a name. And any other instance is given a name. So one of the first things I would suggest that you do is after you install that default instance, which normally is going to be used for your line of business applications. But I want you to get a dedicated instance of SQL for SharePoint. And as we go through the session, you're going to see why that'll be beneficial. So on your first lunch, the first time you take out your DBA, ask them to install SQL Server, an instance of SQL Server for you that'll be dedicated to SharePoint, and then give it an easy name for you to remember, like SharePoint. So when you start working with that instance of SQL Server from within SharePoint, it'll be easy for you to remember, oh yeah, I'm working with the server name / the instance name of SharePoint. So the server name being the SQL Server name. Each of the instances are managed individually. Now, I have the same program group that allows me to manage each instance, but there's changes I can make to my SharePoint SQL Server instance that won't affect my line of business instance. So that's why I want you to have a dedicated instance to SharePoint, so you can make a change or some changes that we're about to talk about, and it won't affect any of your other applications that are out there. Now, these instances that are stored are installed on a virtual machine or a physical server. They share the resources. So if I've got 64 gigs of RAM on a physical box, my 3 instances of SQL Server, we'll say, are sharing that instance of that amount of RAM. Same in the processor, the core processors. They share those instances or those resources. So it's important for you to know that, because if you talk to your DBA over lunch the next month, you say, yeah, since we've talked, I've got 10 instances of SQL Server running on that one box. I'm glad you told me that. Well, now you're thinking back in your mind, oh, no wonder SharePoint's running a little slower, because now SharePoint is now sharing those system resources with 9 other instances of SQL Server. All right? So they can have up to 50. We hopefully they won't do that, and most DBAs will be smart enough not to do that, by the way. But they can do that. And just remember, if they do have multiple instances, we are sharing our resources. Okay, so we got to make sure those resources, and you may be helpful in justifying the need for additional RAM or additional drive space. All right. Now, whenever I create a database, and again, this is an intro to SQL Server. Whenever I create a database, there's at least 2 files created for me on the hard drives. The MDF file, which is the master data file, that's where all my data is actually stored, and there's an LDF file. The LDF file is what's called a transaction log. Every time I do an insert or an update or a delete, it actually writes it to the LDF. And I'm going to say roughly 60 seconds later, there's a process that's built in the SQL Server that takes that insert, that update, the delete, and it writes it to the MDF. All right? So we have 2 files for every instance of every database that we create. We're going to get into the SharePoint piece of this in just a few moments. So for those of you that are in the SharePoint world, don't doze off on me quite yet. Optionally, we can have an MDF, an optional file, which allows us to extend databases. So if we have a database and our MDF is on a physical drive and we want to extend that or giving it more space, we can add what's called NDF files. All right? So when I'm in Central Admin and I create a new web app and it asks me for that database, behind the scenes on that SQL Server box, whether it be physical or virtual, it's creating an MDF file and an LDF file. I don't need to worry about it. It's going to create that for me. Or if your DBA creates a database for you, it says, hey, I created this database for you for your web app. Here's the name of it. It's created an MDF file and an LDF file. You have to have those 2 files to exist. Now, those file extensions aren't required. You could change them, but 99% of the installations in the SQL Server are going to use those extensions, so you don't need to worry about, so it doesn't get confusing with anyone else. Now, there's 2 types of databases that we have in a SQL Server instance. There's the user databases, like our config database for SharePoint, our central admin database, our web app databases, and our service app databases. Those are all considered user databases. Now, for every instance of SQL Server, we also get 4 system databases. So if I have my default instance, I have a master database, an MSDB database, a TempDB database, and a model database. If I get my SharePoint named instance, I have an MSDB database, a master database, a TempDB database, and a model database. They're all unique per data, for each instance of SQL Server. Now, the master database for SQL Server is similar to our config database of SharePoint. If I make any type of configuration in SharePoint, it's stored in the config database. Well, the master database, if I make any type of configuration for SQL Server, it's stored in the master database. As a SharePoint admin, I'm not too concerned about that as long as my DBA is backing that up. So I'm not concerned about that, using that or configuring that to improve performance on the SharePoint world. The MSDB database, that's used for SQL Server automation. Your DBAs can create what are called jobs, alerts, replications handled in there, operators are all handled in there. So when they create a job to perform a backup, that's stored in the MSDB database. Again, as SharePoint admins, we're not concerned about that. The 2 databases that are system databases for our instance of SQL Server for SharePoint that we should be concerned about are TempDB and Model. Now, TempDB is a temporary work storage area. What this does, if you create a bunch of views in SharePoint and you're slicing and dicing and adding indexes in SharePoint to create those views and make those a little bit more optimized, it needs a temporary work storage area to store that content when it's doing that slicing and dicing. So what it does, it puts it in this TempDB database, and it slices and dices and shuffles the rows out, and then it presents that content to you. The location of the TempDB and some of the default settings are very important to the performance of SharePoint. The model database is another one. We're going to dig into these in more detail, by the way. The model database is another one. Every new database that I create, whether I create it from inside a SQL Server or I create it inside of SharePoint, it takes a Polaroid picture or a snapshot of that model database settings, most of the model database settings, and I'll show you what I mean by that just shortly. It takes a snapshot of that, and it uses that as a template for every new database. So if I'm in SharePoint and I create a new web app and I give it a database name, it's taking a picture of the model database and it's using most of its settings to go out and use that as a template for my new database for SharePoint. Those 2 that are in red or orangish red up there are the ones that we need to be concerned with as SharePoint admins, and we need to have discussions with our DBAs or SQL DBAs around those. So the integration, we've been talking a little bit about this. The first bullet is already all SharePoint versions and SQL Server versions. This session is applicable to every combination that you can think of out there. I'm going to go back to 2003, but we'll start with SharePoint 2007, SQL 2005, SharePoint 2010, SQL 2008 or R2, SharePoint 2013, SQL 2008 R2, or SharePoint or SQL 2012. It's all relevant to what we're about to talk about. There's a couple settings I'll point out to you when we get in there that are different. The reason we're concerned with this is I would say 93% of all of our information that we manage in SharePoint is stored in SQL Server. How do I know it's 93%? Because 73.8% of all statistics are made up on the spot. So 93% roughly are stored in SQL Server. Our farm configuration information is stored in our config database. Our central admin configuration information is stored in our central admin content database. That one with a huge GUID on the end of it. That's ginormous, the size of Europe. All of our content with our web applications is stored in SQL Server. All of our service applications, most every service application has at least one database. Search has 4 of them in SharePoint 2013. User Profile still has 3, I believe, in 2013. So if we do an installation of SQL Server and we're having it host our content from SharePoint, and we do what, just kind of walk through the installation. So a farm has several databases, up to 20 databases. Now, if you do what's called a spousal installation in SharePoint or any product, but anybody know what a spousal installation is? I'm sorry? So a spousal installation includes the use of the farm configuration wizard. A spousal installation is when you sit there and you say, okay, 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 okay. Kind of like you do with your spouses, okay? You just kind of sit there and hit okay or enter or whatever, just keep going. So a spousal installation, you just keep pounding on okay until the installation's done, which would include, in this case, the farm configuration wizard, which means we'd install all of those service applications, which would give us about 20 databases in SharePoint 2013, okay? Now, again, your DBAs are like, dude, there was only like 6 or 7 or 8 because, back in 2007. We had the shared service provider back in 2007. We didn't have all these service application databases. So your DBAs, with a lot of therapy, have been able to work with our SharePoint admins and now understand that we have a lot of databases, but they're easy to manage and configure because we have our own separate instance of SQL Server. So what we don't want to do is a spousal installation, and we want to try to avoid using that farm configuration wizard to install the service applications. A, because they have those huge GUIDs on the end of the database names, and B, they're all stuck in one application pool. All right, so we want to avoid using that farm configuration wizard if at all possible. Now, as you know, just a little bit of a review for our SharePoints. Again, it's a little bit of SQL, a little bit of SharePoint to give us a mixed bag here for our audience. A site collection that we create can reside in only one database. So whenever I create my web app, I create that one database. My first site collection goes in there by default, unless I go in and create another database. A content database for a web app can contain many, many site collections. All right, I think it's 2,000 is the warning by default in SharePoint 2013, and 5,000 the maximum. Now, Microsoft has what's called a soft limit of a database. Anybody know what the soft limit size of a database is for SharePoint databases? I'm not going to tell you what it is, but so there's a soft limit of 200 gigabytes. Now, that's a soft limit because it's not like you can't have 400 gigabytes or 500 or terabyte. You can do that. But for performance reasons and for recoverability, if you have a 4-hour service level agreement that your content will never be down for more than 4 hours, if you have a database that's less than 200 gigabytes or around 200 gigabytes, you should be able to recover that database within that 4-hour window. I've been into consulting situations where I was in there on a Monday afternoon. They said, oh, by the way, SharePoint went down last Thursday. Could we look at that sometime tomorrow? So obviously there's no service level agreement there, so you wouldn't have to worry too much about the size of it. But the recommendation is for performance is to keep it around 200 gigabytes on the database size. Now, it's us as SharePoint administrators, instead of us talking to DBAs and say, hey, would you make sure this database doesn't get larger than 200 gigabytes? We can manage that using quota templates, and we can also manage that with the number of site collections. So remember, we can control the number of site collections that go into a database from within central admin. And we can also control the size of each site collection going in that database by setting up a quota template. So without even bothering the DBAs, we can control the size of our databases by setting a quota template up for every site collection going in our database and setting up a maximum number of site collections for each database. Remember, I think the default is 2,000 is the warning and 5,000 is the maximum number of site collections per database. But we can minimize that. We can make that smaller. So let's walk through a little exercise here. Let's say we just came out of a meeting and we decided that looks like down the road we're going to need 800 site collections, and we're going to need and they're going to require 500 megabytes each. Okay? So how many site collections can I put in each database using that basic math? I need 800, 500 megabytes each. I want to limit myself to the 200 gigabytes. If you do quick math on you guys are hungry and maybe hungover, I don't know about that piece, but if you do the quick math, well, if it's 500 megabytes each times 2, that's 2 site collections. I only want to go to 200 gigabytes, so it's 2 times 200. So quick math says I'm at 400 site collections. Okay? Does that make sense? I know it's a little complex. I should probably draw it up there, but it's not. It's really, okay, but what's the trick? You see what I've got up there? I got 250. Why do you think I want 250 instead of 400? SharePoint administrator should be able to help me this. What else is included with the size of a site collection? I'm sorry? No, transaction log? No. No. Second stage recycle bin. Default setting on web apps is 50%. So these site collections that were supposedly 500 are really 750 if we leave the default web app setting. That's where I went from 400 site collections per database to keep it under that 200 gigabytes to roughly 250. If you do the math, it's probably not 250. It's probably 263 or something. So what we'll do is we'll go in, and because we wanted to compensate for the 50% of the site collection, we need to minimize the number of site collections. We need to lower that maximum number of site collections. We do that right through central admin, content database. We change that maximum from 5,000 down to 250, maybe a warning at 200. And the cool thing is if we do this up front, so let's say if we're going to use this 200 gigabytes, we're going to need 800 site collections, 500 each. Well, we're going to put 250 in the first database, 250 in the second database. That gives me 500 site collections. 250 in the third database will give me 750 site collections. Well, I'm short 50 because I need 800. So I'm going to create 4 databases. All right, I'm going to set up a quota template of 500 megabytes. I'm going to max site collection size at 250, and I, from inside of SharePoint, can manage that size of that database. Okay? Now, if we do this up front, this uses a round-robin approach, which means when I create that first site collection, it's going to go to database number 1. Site collection 2 goes into database number 2. Site collection 3 goes to database number 3. Site collection 4 goes to database number 4. Site collection 5 round robins back around to database number 1. So what if I have a database out there that has 30 site collections and I decide I need to add another site collection or another database to it? The next 30 databases or site collections that you create will go into that second content database until they even up at 30 each. And then it'll round robin between the both of them. Okay? You can, using a PowerShell command, it's easier. There's a couple ways you can do this actually. You can force a site collection into a specific database using either PowerShell or by going into central admin and taking site or database number 1 offline. Anybody have done that, taking it offline in central admin? Okay, or using PowerShell. So what that does, it will make that unavailable for any new site collections. The data is still available for your users. The people don't know, your end users don't know the data is not, or that database is offline. It's just not going to be able to take any new site collections. So we could take a database offline, create a new site collection, and force it into a database. Now what you should not do is leave that offline. I've seen people do this. If you leave it offline, a lot of timer jobs don't access it. Crawler doesn't crawl it. So if you're going to take a database offline, make it a temporary offline, create the site collection that you want to create, and bring that baby back online so the normal processes and jobs run against that database. All right, any questions on this slide? So 200 gigabytes is our soft limit. We control that from inside of SharePoint by putting a quota template on the web app for the content database or databases. And then we also put a maximum number of site collections on each of those databases. And it's per database per web app. So if I have 4 databases on a web app, I need to put a max site collection on each one of those. Okay, SQL Server configurations. I've already alluded to this. We're going to get ready to go into a demo. The model database is a concern of ours. All right, increase the initial size. I'll show you what that means when I get inside. Increase auto growth setting. I'll show you what that means when I get inside as well. TempDB database. Again, what we're going to do with model, we're going to do with that. We're also going to put it in what's called simple recovery model. I'll explain that in just a few moments. And then we also want to place that one, the temp DB, on a different drive than what your database, well, your content databases are. Because remember, that one's doing all the slicing and dicing of content. So that's pretty busy versus doing a basic insert of a column or a couple columns when it's actually shuffling content around. So you want to move it off to a different drive. You can have multiple files associated with a temp DB, and I'll have them spread across multiple drives. So I could have 4 temp DB databases. Well, we'd have our MDF file on one drive and 3 NDF files on 3 other drives to help spread that across multiple drives for performance. Let's see what I have here. So those are database settings. We also have the instance settings. This is why I want you to have your own instance of SQL Server for SharePoint. First off, the default database file location for all of your databases is on the C drive. Now we know it makes life easier for everybody if everything's on the C. I think everything should be on the C drive. All the logging should be on the C drive. The operating system should be on the C drive. The transaction log should be on the C drive. The data files, put everything on the C drive so you never have to worry about where to find it, right? No? Good, thank you. All right, no, absolutely not. So we want to move our database files off from the C drive. And as you know, for SharePoint admins, one of the things we can do for performance, most of our logging by default in SharePoint is on the C drive. Get that moved as quickly as possible as a side note here. You're going to see when I go in the image that SQL Server, each instance of SQL Server is an absolute memory hog. It will take as much memory as it gets its hands on unless we give it some sort of control. And I'll show you that when we get inside there. So that's another setting that we can set inside of SQL Server per instance of SQL Server. Remember, we have shared resources of 64 gigs. We can control the minimum and maximum memory size. And something else that's unique about SharePoint, it requires a certain collation. Now, I'm going to show you the default SQL Server instance collation. And if I ask the DBA to walk up, and I walk to the DBA and say, hey, will you create me a database and call it TechEd Europe 2013. He could go into SQL Server, create a TechEd Europe 2013. He'll call me up and tell me, hey, Brian, I just created that database for you. I can now go into Manage Content Database in Central Admin. I can open up a web app, choose a web app, and I can try to connect to that. And what's it going to do? It's going to yell at me and say incorrect collation. Because our default SQL Server instance collation is not what SharePoint requires, which is this guy right here. SharePoint requires Latin 1 general, case insensitive, accent sensitive, kana sensitive for Asian languages, and width sensitive. If it's not of that collation, when your DBA creates your databases for you, you're not going to be able to communicate with it. So what they can do, because we have our own instance of SQL Server for SharePoint, during the installation, and only during the installation, well, the easiest way is during the installation, is to set that installation of SQL Server for SharePoint to use that collation. Now, whenever they create a database for you, it's going to have the correct collation for you. Collations handle the internal of the information, like case insensitive. If I type in capital M, C, capital D, O-N-A-L-D for McDonald, and then I type in lowercase m, C, lowercase d, I want that all to be the same. If I don't use a case insensitive or one that's required by SharePoint, if I don't use case insensitivity, then the person that's doing a search is going to have to yell, oh, that's a capital M, that's a capital D. We don't want them to have to worry about that. So that's why it has to be case insensitive. So this collation is required by SharePoint. If we have a dedicated instance of SQL for SharePoint, we'll be able to manage that, and our DBAs can create a database for us and not worry about a incorrect collation setting. So collation general, there's something else that's going to say. It's Lat 1 general, CIS, KSWS. So once they add that, like I said, once they create the instance, they can't change that setting. They would have to dump, I don't mean back up the data, they have to actually dump the data out the flat files, rebuild that instance, and then add the data back in. So you can't change the collation that easily. You can change it per database, but you can't change the collation after it. So you may as well, if it's a dedicated instance of SQL Server for SharePoint, is set that collation up during the install. And your DBAs will know where that is on the way in. All right, let's go see where some of this magic happens. So I'm in my instance of SQL Server here that's dedicated to SharePoint. And here are my databases. You can see I've got some services installed here. I've got search installed up there. I've got the state service installed. My MTP portal content database is installed. Here's my SharePoint config. Now let me show you that collation first. So if I go up to, let's go up to my master database, and I'm going to right-click and go to Properties. And here's the default collation right here out of the box for SQL Server. So if a DBA just does an installation, most of the time they're not going to mess with the collation. There's really no reason until somebody like SharePoint comes along and says, dude, I need a special collation. All right? So if I just did an installation of SQL Server for my SharePoint instance, it's going to pick up SQL, Latin 1, General, can't read the rest. You guys can see it hopefully better. CP1, CIAS. And again, if my DBA creates a database called TechEd Europe 2013, calls me up and said, dude, your database is created, I'm not going to be able to use it. What it needs to be, as I showed you, I mentioned earlier, let me cancel this. Let me go into my portal database that I created. I created this. So the cool thing is, when I create my databases from inside of SharePoint, it knows to use the correct collation. The collation issue is it only is as a concern if my DBAs create my databases for me. And some DBAs are a little protective about their databases, and they will want to create the databases for you. They'll tell you what the database name is, and then you'll supply that when you create your web app. So if I go to collation for my portal database, you'll see this is the one that's required by SharePoint. Latin 1, General, CIAS, KS, WS. Okay? So that's one thing that we have to do. So one thing they can do on the installation or during the installation is to be able to go in and set that default collation so every new database that they create or we create will use this collation setting. So again, let me just reiterate. If we create the database from inside of SharePoint, we're good. If our DBAs create the databases for us and give us the names, we're not good, unless they create that using the correct collation when they create the database. Okay? So that's one thing there. All right. So that's the master. Let's go into the TempDB database and go to Properties. Your question? Yes. So the question is, if I'm inside of SharePoint and I click on a view or a document within a view, or does it talk to the TempDB database or does it talk to the MDF? It actually just talks to the content database. It's only if I'm actually creating a new view or adding indexes where it needs to shuffle the data around is when we use the TempDB. Okay? All right. So we were going to go into the properties here. And let's go to Files here. And you're going to see for the TempDB, what I'm about to do would also be applicable to our model database. But for the TempDB, notice a few things. By the way, this is not a badness on the DBA's part. This is default settings for a SQL Server installation. All right? So what this is here, TempDB, we have the initial size of 8 megabytes for the MDF file and 1 megabyte for the LDF file. And if it needs to grow, it grows by 10% for both of those. Okay? So if I'm trying to add content or it needs more room to add content to slice and dice, it's going to grow by 10%. So what's 10% of 1 meg? 1K, what is it? Whatever it is. Yeah, so we'll just say 1K. So it's going to grow in baby steps. I'll reference this better in the model database, actually. So initial size is a concern. I'm not going to fix it here, but I'm going to fix it in model. I'm going to show you what the problems are here, but I'm actually address them in model. And you would apply them to both the TempDB and the model database. So initial size is too small for TempDB. So the caveat or the good news is it's not going to fail on the TempDB, the slice and dice, because we got autogrowth turned on. So what do you think is a problem with having autogrowth turned on? A concern? Exactly. Extend. So if I start extending, two things are going to happen. Every time it extends, it's a performance degradation because I have to wait for it to grow. Secondly, I could have content fragmented all over my drives. So we want to avoid the use of autogrowth. We want to leave it on as an insurance policy, as a safety net so people can load content and don't get shut down or prevented from loading content. But we don't want it to be the norm. We want it to be the exception. So what's the other problem here? the location. Okay, by default, when you install SQL Server, unless they change it during the installation, it goes to SQL and program files, that path up there. You see the MDF and the LDF are on the same physical drive. That's absolute badness, all right? So a couple problems are for databases are initial size, auto growth, and location. What's one other problem? What's that? You should have an extra NDF file per server core. We talked about if you're going to use NDF files, we want to put those on a TempDB. We want to spread those across, one per core. That's exactly right. All right, so these problems that we're seeing here, I'm going to go to the model database, are the same thing that we're going to see over here for files, 3 and 1, 1 and 10, and then the C location, the C drive. So first thing we want to do is we want to fix that. We want to first fix that initial size, all right? So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the initial size for the MDF file. Remember, we had that conversation where we want 200 gigabyte databases. I don't have enough room on this particular image. So I'm going to say that we're going to set this to 200 megabytes instead of 200 gigabytes. So when I create a database, it's going to create a 200 megabyte database, the MDF file. Your LDF file is normally anywhere between 10 and 25%. I always lean it towards a 25. So I'm going to do 25% of 200 is going to be 50. So I'm going to make that as my default for the model. Set that to 50. Now the other concern that I have is this guy here. So let me tell you the problem with this setting right here. I'm at 200 megabytes. Let's say I go in and I hit OK right now. I create this model database and I set the initial size to 200 megabytes. Then I go out and create a new database from inside a SQL Server. It's 200 megabytes. Somebody sends me a video and says they want to upload this into SharePoint. It's 250 megabytes. Okay? Well, the good news is, or the bad news, depends how you look at it. The good news is, while this is 200, so we've got almost of it. Let's even assume 10% of that's taken. Or no, we'll just leave the 200 to keep the math easy. So we've got 200 megabytes of free space, we'll say. And we're going to add a 250 megabyte file. Well, it's not going to have enough room. But we have auto growth turned on. With auto growth turned on, it's not going to prevent that file from being uploaded. Okay? But what it's going to do, it's going to grow by default in 1 megabyte increments. So I've got room for 200. I need 50 more. So it's going to stop. It's going to grow 1 megabyte. Okay, here's 1 more megabyte of data. Now I need 49 more megabytes. It's going to stop and grow another mega. It's going to do that 50 times, folks. That's not good for performance. So although we want auto growth as an insurance policy, we don't want it to grow in baby steps. We want it to grow in significant steps or size so it doesn't have to stop and grow, stop and grow, stop and grow 50 times in an example. So what we want to do is change this auto growth to something. And I like to use megabytes because I know exactly how long it's going to take. So I usually do 50% myself. So I'm going to go 100 of my 200 here. And the reason I like to use megabytes versus percentage because I know exactly how long it's going to take for that to grow every time. If this was 200 gigabytes and that was going to grow 200 megabytes every time, 200 gigabytes, 20 gigabytes every time, I know it's going to take 45 seconds. But if it's a percentage, it might take 0.3 nanoseconds, and it might take 4 minutes, because depending on the size of the database. So if you set it as a megabyte versus a percentage, you know exactly how long it's going to take for that auto growth to take place. So we're going to change the same thing for the LDF file. We're going to change that to megabytes, and we'll do that 50% as well. Okay? Now I can't fix the program. I can't fix the location here. I can try to. If I do, it's not going to work correctly. We'll just put it that way. So a lot of people, again, well, the model database does the location. I can change the location for my MDF, my LDF on the model database. You don't do that here. So I'm going to click and save this one right here. I'm going to do an OK. So now if I'm not going to create a new database as of yet. I'm going to right-click, do new database, and I'm just going to show you. Here's my 200, here's my 50, here's my 100, here's my 25. But again, what's the problem if I create this database from inside a SQL Server right now? Well, it's on the C drive, which we're going to fix next, and that collation is still incorrect. Okay? So we got to be careful about that. Now I can come over, as long as the DBA remembers to do this, hit Options. Here's the collation. There's a gazillion of them in here. What is it? Go into L's. It was Latin 1 General. See how these 100s, we get to blow by those. It's Latin 1 General, CIAS, KSWS. So as long as my DBA remembers to do that, when he creates the database for me, this will work for me from inside of SharePoint. But if he does it, he just blows through that with the default collation settings, we will not be able to use this database from SharePoint. Okay? So let's make it easy on ourselves. We're going to have a dedicated instance of SQL Server for SharePoint. Bam, on the installation, we install it and we say, hey, we want all the default instances, collations to be what SharePoint requires. Okay, so we can fix that there on a new database. I'm not going to create this database because we still have to fix the path thing. We still have the problem here, if I scroll to the right, of that going into that path environment, which we don't want it in. So let's go fix that first. I'm not going to create this. Now, I don't have multiple drives on here, so we're going to have to fake this out. You'll have to pretend with me that I have a D drive and an E drive, and all I'm really going to do is create a new folder called SQL, hands on the home row key, SQL data, or some of my friends say in the US, data, and we'll call SQL logs. So what we're going to do is go back into SQL now, and we're going to go, this is actually an instance level setting, which means I'm going to go up to the instance dedicated to SQL Server, the instance of SQL Server dedicated to SharePoint, and I can have those files put in specific locations which are different from my other instance of SQL Server where it's hosting my line of business applications. Another reason to have a dedicated instance of SQL Server. So we have collation, and now we have location. That will be beneficial. So I'm going to right-click on this and go to Properties for this instance. I'm going to go to Database Settings. Now, if you're running SQL Server 2008, you're going to have a SQL Server data, and you're going to have you're going to have a data and a log. You won't have a backup unless you're running SQL Server 2012. Okay? So if you're in SQL Server 2008, what we're going to do is we're going to change this SQL and SQL data, which is really pretend that's the D drive or wherever we want to put our data files. And this would be a C colon. Again, pretend that's a L colon. And you could set up your backups there. I didn't create the directory. I won't jump out for that. But you could in 2012. SQL 2012 allows you to set up your backup locations. So we're going to change that here. Then we'll do an OK. Now I need to restart SQL Server in order to do this. So I'm going to right-click and do a restart. Otherwise, that won't pick it up. Now, I say it won't pick it up. It will pick it up from inside a SQL Server. It won't pick it up when I create a database from inside of SharePoint. Okay? So if I just left that, I didn't do the restart that I'm doing now, inside of SQL Server, it'd come up with a new path. As soon as I create a database from inside of SharePoint, it doesn't pick up the new path because it's looking at the default settings for the instance. Now let's click New Database. And you'll see we've got our settings here, and you'll see we've got our new locations. Okay? So again, just to remind you, these are just default settings by SQL Server that we need to address as DBAs or have a discussion with our DBAs, or DBA has a discussion with you and says, hey, we've got a separate instance of SQL Server just for SharePoint. We've got your data files here, we've got your log files here for disaster recovery. So it helps with disaster recovery, and it helps with performance as well. All right, so we'll actually create this database, and now because I want SharePoint to use this, and I didn't set it up on the way in correctly, in being the installation, we will do this guy right here after I give it a name. SP_DB. Now, whenever I create a database, whether I create it inside a SQL Server or I create it inside a SharePoint, I always put _DB on the end. It gives you better performance. Anybody believe that? Good, good. I just do it. People are like, why do you always put underscore DB? I don't know. Just to me, it's like, if I put like SP out there, or content, SP underscore content, it just feels like it's half naked. It needs underscore DB on the end of it. So anyways, it doesn't need it for performance, but it looks better. So now we have a new database that's out there. So another concern of ours, so let's regroup here. Let's go back up and review. So we've resolved the issue with the model database being, the initial size is larger on both the MDF and the LDF files. We've changed the location for those. We either create the database using the new collation setting, or during the installation, we set the collation setting for SharePoint, because it's going to be dedicated to SharePoint. So we resolved those issues. Another issue that we have is that SQL Server, each instance of SQL Server is a hog or when it comes to memory. Let me show you that. If I click memory for this one instance on my box here, this instance can take up to 2,147,483,647 megabytes of RAM. And if it's out there, it will go get that. So if I have 3 instances of SQL Server on this box, first one in wins. All right? So if I have 64 gigs on this box, I come in first thing in the morning, I beat everybody in the office, and I start running these huge queries. It's, by default, it will consume as much RAM. It's supposed to throttle it back not to affect the operating system. So let's say I have the 64. It'll leave 40 for the operating system, but it will take the other 60. And if you have any other instance of SQL Server on there, maybe you have Exchange on there, it should be a dedicated box, but if you have any other application on there, they're hosed. They're not going to be able to work, all right, because all the RAM is taken by this instance. So if we have 64 gigs of RAM, we need to put a cap on each of those. I'm going to go back to 3 instances of SQL Server. Doesn't have to be an even cap. So what I can do is like, all right, we'll take 64, let's subtract 4, and just leave that for the OS, the operating system. Let's give 20 gigabytes of that remaining 60. We'll give 20 to the line of business apps. All right, so we just come in and set this to 20 for the line of business apps. And then we're going to give 30 to the SharePoint. So I just change this number to something like this. I think that's 30 gigs. And I would do the 30 gigs for SharePoint. I'd do the 20 gigs for the line of business apps. Remember, we had that third instance that's running just a baby database somewhere. And we put a 10 gig max on that one as well. So now when this guy hits 30, it's like, dude, you're done. I can't give you any more RAM because you've hit your ceiling. And I'm not affecting my other 2 applications, or my other 2 instances of SQL Server. So we have to give it some sort of cap. If you have a server that's hosting multiple applications, SharePoint and Exchange, or I'm sorry, SQL and Exchange, or whatever it may be, or even if you have multiple instances of SQL Server, you have to give it a ceiling so that one instance of that SQL Server doesn't come in and capture all that memory. Now, the other thing we can do, the good thing, the nice thing about SQL Server, is that when it's done with the memory, it'll release it back to the operating system. Okay? So if I hit 30 gigs, and then I peaked out at 30 gigs, and I'm done with whatever I need to do, and I drop back down to 20, the other 10 will go back to the operating system now. But what we could do is, because we want to control this a little bit better, is we could set it up to a minimum. Let's do this, 25. So what this says, instead of releasing it back to the operating system, and 5 minutes later it's like, oh, I need that RAM back. Sorry, man, somebody else has got it now. All right? What we could do is set up a minimum on it as well. Now, this is not going to just give it 25 gigs of RAM. It's going to say, hey, when you get to 25 gigs of RAM, I won't drop you below 25. All right? So if I see you climbing, that's cool. This is RAM. It's free for everybody. But once you hit this, once you're between that 25 and 30, until I restart SQL Server, I will never drop you below the 25 again. So I'll always believe it be in that window of 25 to 30. Okay? So this avoids the contention for that available RAM, because what if I drop 30 and I forgot to cap one of the other instances? I drop down 30, I drop 20 back to the operating system, another instance or another application grabbed it, I come back now, it's like, oh man, I don't have enough RAM to work with. So it won't allocate 25 gigs to the instance. It will say, when you get to that 25 gigs, dude, I won't drop you below that 25 again until we restart SQL Server, then we'll start over again. So we could do that. I can't save these settings because I don't have this much RAM on my machine. But this is where you could go in and set this to control that. And again, you'd have to do this for each instance of SQL Server, all 3. They don't have to be equal. This one's going to get 30. The line of business app's going to get 20. The other one's going to get 10. That's all fine. And then it's documented that it throttles back and does not take too much from the, so it doesn't affect the operating system. I just leave 4 out there just for the operating system. So if you have 64, just don't even worry about 4. Pretend that's not there. Leave that for the operating system. Okay. Remember we talked about those two. Let me go to, where's my portal? Right here. So if I go to this guy here and go to Properties and go to Files, notice even though I set the model database, the existing databases are not picked up. This is for all new databases. So what we just did, remember that was a snapshot when I created a new database. So I have all my databases out here that still are low and have bad settings. So this is not an easy fix, but we can, this part's easy. I can bring this up to 200. And I'm going to have this at 50. And I could change this to 100. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the settings I set up for model and I'm applying them for my existing databases. This piece right here, not so easy. What this requires, and I will reblog this, we'll put it that way, on how to do this. I have a blog that says a few things. I have one that talks about how to get rid of that GUID on the end of the database names. The central admin content database got the GUID on the end. We can toast that. All your content databases, we can toast those. But there are steps you need to take. You need to kind of detach them from SharePoint, detach them from SQL Server. This is where this would come in here because it would be applicable here. Move it to the SQL and SQL data, SQL and SQL logs, reattach to SQL, re-bring it into SharePoint. You won't lose any content. It's step by step on how to do that. But to update the existing databases, I can update the sizes, but I can't update the location without actually taking them offline in SharePoint, detaching them in SQL Server. You need to get your DBAs involved. Again, a reason to take them to lunch. Detach them from SQL Server. They just move them where you want. Rename them while you've got them offline. So to get rid of that GUID, you got more of a user-friendly name. They'll reattach them. You bring them back online with a new name inside of SharePoint. Okay, so you can do that, but it's not as easy as just coming in and changing this location here. So we'll just change this portal database size. So the size and the auto growth. And again, I want to emphasize, auto growth is an exception. You don't want the fragmentation it's causing, and you want the performance degradation it causes. It's just there to prevent, to allow or avoid someone not being able to add content to SharePoint. The recovery model. Let me go back to MSDB and properties and options. You'll see this is simple recovery model. There's two I want you to be concerned with here. In production, 99% of the time you're going to use full recovery model. In something like MSDB is like RAM. What happens to all the content in RAM when a system shuts down and you bring it back up? It gets flushed. MSDB is the same way. It's just a temporary work storage area. When I just did that restart of SQL Server, everything that was in TempDB was flushed. Okay? Now, TempDB is one of those databases that's unique in the sense that we've got, remember I told you, I have the LDF and the MDF file. The LDF file, all the inserts, updates, and deletes are written here. 60 seconds later, we'll just do that number. There's a process inside a SQL Server called Checkpoint. It writes those inserts, updates, and deletes to the MDF file. That's all. This, Oracle does the same thing. This transaction log file is just for data recovery. And I do another session, not at TechEd, but another session on data recovery. So I'm going to do a quick little excerpt from that. So this checkpoint process, every 60 seconds, if it's in simple recovery model, as is the MSDB database, TempDB, it flushes those transactions. Those 3 inserts and those 4 updates and those 3 deletes that just went to the MDF file now gets removed from the LDF file. Okay? That's simple recovery model. Full recovery model, they remain in this LDF file. Okay? That's the good thing. We want that for production. Right? For production purposes, for disaster recovery purposes, I should say, we don't want to flush our LDF file out every 60 seconds because we won't be able to use that to do a disaster recovery. Depending on time, I've got a slide threw in here just at the last minute that if I have time, I'll talk to you. Has anybody seen ginormous transaction log files? I mean, just huge like there's one place that has a 384 megabyte MDF file, 11.2 gigabyte LDF file. The problem is, if you research that online, it's going to tell you to do one of two things. First, it's going to tell you, well, put your database in simple recovery model. Bzz, don't do that, because you're going to hose yourself when it comes into doing disaster recovery. The other option is the problem, the reason that happens is because the LDF file never gets flushed. Now, if you read the documentation from Microsoft, it says that when you back up the MDF, when you do a full backup in SQL Server, it backs up the transaction log. It's partially accurate. It is accurate, actually. It's true. It does do a backup, but it doesn't back up, nor does it does not flush the LDF file. That's why you get those huge LDF files, because you haven't done an actual SQL Server backup of the LDF file, the log file. It's a backup log statement. So I'll try to throw that slide up real quick here when we come out of this image. All right, so simple recovery model. You don't want to use in production. You don't want to set your model database, because all your new content databases or service app databases will now be flushing every 60 seconds. You don't want to do that in production. If you're in a dev area where you don't need to have all the content, you don't want to worry about ginormous transaction logs, go ahead and throw it in simple recovery model, because you just go to the database, the production area, and say, get another copy of it. But in production, most of the time, you're going to avoid putting that in simple recovery model for production. All right, let me minimize this. Okay, some best practices. Dedicated server instance with a SQL Server alias. So what you can do, we talked about a few reasons for a dedicated server instance of SQL Server. Collation can be set, the location of files can be set, memory settings can be set individually for that particular set of that instance of SQL Server. One of the things that we tend to do in SharePoint is we call up our DBA and say, hey, will you get me a SQL Server instance? They'll put it on SQL Server 123. So what do? Is I put that SQL Server 123 in everything that I touch inside of SharePoint. So what happens if they want to put that on, they want to move that instance of SQL Server to an upgraded box that's SQL Server 456. I need to go into SharePoint and change everything from SQL Server 123 to SQL Server 456. What you can ask your DBA over yet another lunch, you already probably have 6 lunches for them already, is to create what's called a SQL Server alias. They do that in the configuration manager inside of SQL Server. What that does is I won't care what box it's on. It could be SQL Server 123 today. I'm looking at an alias called SP_SQL. That's the alias name they gave me. So if they want to move it off from SQL Server 123 to SQL Server 456, as long as they change that alias to now point to SQL Server 456, they can do all they want in the background. It's easier for them and it's easier for you if you set that instance up with an alias. So when you talk to them, it's like, yeah, if I get a dedicated instance, and if you don't mind creating an alias for me, that way you guys can do what you want behind the scenes. It'll behoove both of you to have that instance set up. No spousal installations, all right? Especially if you throw the farm configuration wizard in. I just did 2 weekends ago a rip and replace, an R&R. Most of the time R&R is rest and relaxation. 2 Sundays ago I did an R&R, which is a rip and replace in my term, because someone had done a spousal installation. Literally, they were using search and managed metadata service. And they had all other 12 or 13 services installed and running on that machine. There was a single server installation. And they had just really literally gone through and just pretty much clicked OK, did a spousal install, installed every instance or every service application in one application pool. It was just a mess. So I spent last Sunday ripping out a SharePoint farm because someone did a spousal install. To meet a 4-hour service level agreement, keep your databases under 200 gigabytes. All right, not a requirement. You can go larger. Just remember, if you do, you got to worry about service level agreements. If you have them, most of us do nowadays. But keep them under 200 gigabytes. Modify your model DB and your temp DB on the initial size and the auto growth settings. Okay, and then if the temp DB, make sure that is in simple recovery model because you want that to get flushed because you don't care what's in there. It's just for slicing and dicing. The auto growth is more of an insurance policy. You don't want to set the initial size to be small. So it'll grow. It's okay. When it grows, it decreases performance. And it also improves or increases fragmentation. So you don't want to use the auto growth. Spread your data files and transaction log files. Try to put them on separate drives. If you keep them on separate drives, it'll help you in the recovery process. And it'll improve performance. So this is all about improving performance. Because every time we write an insert, do an insert, update, or delete, it's going to write it to the LDF, which is on this drive. And it's going to write it to the MDF file, which is on this file, and on this drive. And more importantly, the fact that we're not going to put it in simple recovery model, we can use that full recovery model for data recovery. And by having them on separate physical drives, or striped or RAID 5 or 10, you'll be able to maintain those transactions as long as you're not in simple recovery model, which will allow you to do a disaster recovery easier. Create multiple temp DB files on multiple disks. That's an NDF files across multiple disks, one per server core. Avoid shrinking database files. I've had people turn auto shrink on. They have auto growth on, then they have auto shrink on. Talk about fragmentation. Spends all day growing, and then at night it's like, oh, it's quiet, and then it shrinks at night. Tomorrow, spends all day growing. You got data all over your drives if it's doing auto shrinking and auto growing. Auto growth, insurance policy. Auto shrink, try to avoid that. Now, if you go in a situation, several of you raised your hand where you've got this ginormous transaction log file, different story. There's a fix for that. But then you want to avoid, what you want to do as a daily routine is to shrink your data files when they're going to grow tomorrow. Generate database maintenance plans. For those of you that raised both hands, you may not be real familiar with SQL Server. Got thrown on you. You accidentally volunteered to get into SharePoint, not knowing SQL Server was behind the scenes so heavily. So if you're not familiar with DB on the SQL Server side, there's a database maintenance plan wizard out there that walks you through setting up backup plans, reports, when to delete them, how to name them, all sorts of information. So if you're not familiar with that, if you're not familiar with SQL Server, you got involuntarily volunteered to manage SQL Server. Check that database maintenance plan. SQL Server SharePoint 2013. How many people have installed that? All right, everybody's seeing the installation initially where it said max degree of parallelism was not set to 1. You had to jump over to SQL Server to fix it. All right, so max degree of parallelism is how SQL Server handles communications internally. Let's step outside of SharePoint for a moment. It's how it responds to requests. If you read articles that are not SharePoint specific, they're going to have you change that. Do not change that from a number 1. Leave it at number 1 for that instance of SQL Server for SharePoint. Yes, sir. Sorry? The default is 0. We want it at number 1. In fact, SharePoint 2013 won't install unless you set it to number 1. So initially, I don't know, I haven't done an install recently. Before, if it was set to 0 and you pointed that instance, the installation would fail, and it would say you need to set the MDOP, max degree of parallelism, to 1. So over jump it, fix it, you're good. My point of this piece is, if you just look for max degree of parallelism online, if you Bing it, Google it, whatever you choose, it might tell you to try to change that. Whatever you see out there, it's not relevant to SharePoint. SharePoint experts, I talked to SharePoint production development team, leave that at 1. It's going to be the best thing you can do for SharePoint. You can monitor disk seconds per read and write. You want to keep that under 20 milliseconds. So just jump into performance monitor, system monitor. Defragment your drives containing content database files. So every once in a while, just run the analysis off hours, after hours, and defrag that. And then avoid ginormous transaction logs. And the only way to do that, and several of you raised your hands, have already seen that. I've seen it. Can't even tell you how many times I've seen that. Because that causes performance issues, because now you've got an 11 gigabyte transaction log file. The only way you can avoid that, I can't say the only way. One way you can avoid that is put it in simple recovery model, which I don't want you to do. Another way is just to back up that transaction log file. All right? Okay. Fortunately, we have enough time to even discuss that one. So this is the scenario. So remember simple recovery model. I said I don't want using simple recovery model. Sunday night, I'm going to do a full backup on my database. All right, we're just going to pick one content database. Monday night, I'm going to do a differential. A differential backup means it's all the changes from Monday. Another word for differential is cumulative. Tuesday night differential is going to change all the changes from Monday and all the changes from Tuesday. Wednesday night's differential, all the changes from Monday, all the changes from Tuesday, all the changes from Wednesday. Okay? Why do I want to do that? When I'm doing a backup, my biggest concern is my restore strategy. I want to minimize the downtime, meet the service level agreements. If I do differential / cumulative backups, as I'm doing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, if I need to perform a disaster recovery, as we're going to allude to in the bottom here in just a moment, when I do that, I'm going to be able to just have to restore this guy over here, and then jump over to restore Wednesday's night differential, because that contains all of the backups, all the changes from Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. All right? That piece makes sense so far? So let's go to a crisis. Thursday at 4 p.m., we lose our MDF file. Remember I had my data files and the SQL data on the D drive, my pretend D drive, and my SQL logs on my pretend L drive? You do want to keep them separate. If I lose my MDF drive, my SQL data drive, all my transactions are still in my LDF file. Hence, I don't want you using simple recovery model. Otherwise, that dude is empty. Okay? If you put that in simple recovery model, there's nothing. I can stop talking right now because I can't help you. But if it's in full recovery model, what we can do now, if I lose my MDF on Thursday, the first thing I'm going to do, as a DBA will know how to do this, is we're going to do a backup log, database name, and then there's, I forget the exact parameter, but that would be backup log, database name, we'll just call it our Northwind database, to some directory, and it's tail log only, I think it's a parameter you do on the end of it. All that does is pretty much go out, take a copy of what's in there, but don't disrupt my normal schedule of backing up those transaction logs or the database. What that does, it takes a picture of all the transactions that are in that LDF file. If that's on the same drive as my data file, those transactions are gone because they're both on the same drive. That drive's toast now. Or if I'm in simple recovery model, the LDF is empty, I can't do this either. So you don't want to put it in simple recovery. You want to keep them separate, and you want to keep them on, keep it in full recovery model. Okay, 4 o'clock, we lose our MDF drive. We're going to issue this statement here, backup log db name to d location.bak, and at the end of it, there's something like, I forget the endpoint only or something like that. I forget the syntax. I'll have to add it because I forget it. So what that's going to do is going to give me the transactions that are in the LDF file for the MDF file that just crashed. The second thing we're going to do now, well, my numbers are off, my bad. So the next thing I'm going to do, the second thing is my number one is to back up the log. My number two is to restore the full backup. So that should be a number 2 over there, is to restore the backup from here. Cool thing is we can do this just like that. Okay, so the first thing to do is we're going to back up the transaction log that contains all the changes for the MDF file that just crashed. Second thing to do is we're going to restore our backup from Sunday. We're going to jump to our restore from Wednesday night because it contains the changes Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. We're going to restore that. Then we're going to go to number 4, which is going to restore that LDF file that we just backed up. Okay? So, because I'm not in simple recovery model, because my LDF and MDF files are in separate drives or spread across an array instance, I can recover content up till 4 p.m. Because right now, without that, if I can't perform that LDF backup in the bottom right there, the best I can do is back up to Wednesday night. But because I'm not in simple recovery model, I can actually back up until Thursday at 4 o'clock, roughly 4 o'clock. Okay, so that's 2 things. It allows me to recover the data because I'm not in simple recovery model and my data files are spread across multiple drives. My data and log files are separate drives, excuse me. But how do I resolve the ginormous T logs? How do I fix that? How do I avoid that? This won't fix it. This will avoid it. What I'm going to do is when am I not so concerned about what's in my data file? Or my log file. Well, I have my production MDF file. Sunday night, I just took a copy of that. So now I got 2 flavors of it. I got full database here, and I got backup of everything. So really what's in the transaction log is not relevant to me anymore. So they can automate this. DBAs know how to do this. They can automate this. If a successful full backup occurs on Sunday night, I can then issue the second command. I can show it on the file up there maybe. Backup log DB name to some directory. with a init, which means overwrite what was there from last week, so you don't have it again, so you just don't have to accumulate a bunch of them. At that point, it'll back up and truncate the log. That's the problem with the ginormous T logs. We don't issue that backup log DB name up above the full backup right there. That's the safest time to do it, because you just did a full backup. You've got your production database. You've got a copy of that right now. Whatever's in the transaction log's already been written to the MDF file that you have in production and in your backups. Now you don't need to worry about it. So you back it up. You store it for a week. Next week, you just clobber it at when it just says overwrite what's there from last week. You can delete it if you want to, but that'll at least keep it for you for a week. So this fixes two things. This emphasizes two things. Don't use simple recovery, first off. Secondly, keep your LDF and MDF files separately or striped. Thirdly, to avoid ginormous transaction logs, perform a backup of the transaction log right after you. The best time to do that is right after you do a database backup, a full database backup. And our schedule happens to be Sunday nights. All right, does that make sense? All right, for some additional information regarding TechEd, we've got Channel 9, Learning, MSDN, and TechNet. Be sure to check out these resources for additional information. There's also a Microsoft SQL Server Management Basics for non-DBAs. I'm not sure when that runs, but it's DBI B205. You may want to check those out. Introduction to Windows PowerShell with Microsoft SharePoint Server 2013 is a lab that you might want to do over in the hall. And there's an exam prep, and I'm not sure if that's still going. I think it is, that you can sit for those of you that may be interested in taking the SharePoint exam. Please take the time to evaluate the session. Use the QR code to evaluate this session. Let's see what else is going on. I'll come back to that. And this is my information, my blog, Twitter handle if you want to follow me, email me. Phone number I'm not good at, so you're better off to email me. And there's my website. Okay, let's go back on the QR code. I forgot my Q&A. What kind of questions do we have? Yes, sir. Right. 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 Correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I would just go with the isolated thing. Is just to me, I would actually personally, I would talk to a DBA about it to see what their opinion is. With SQL experts, because I'm more in the SharePoint world, but. On your explanation to me, I wouldn't do it either. Exactly, especially with virtualizing. How many people are virtualizing SQL nowadays? Okay, it's come a long way then. Good. All right, I know lunch is around the corner. Thank you very much, folks. I'll be around. We'll have the Ask the Experts tonight, so feel free to stop by if you have any questions this afternoon. Thank you.